So before we begin properly, I'll just read um, these few statements, just a way of introducing us into the topic. Babylon, specifically Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon, and he had this dream. But before I read out the dream, discuss the dream he had, I'll just introduce these statements. So first of all, we have to understand that the spiritual life on earth does not exist in isolation, but interacts or relates with the physical space or realm. And the Most High, who has made us, was pleased to place us in a physical space to interact with our use our five senses to interact with the environment. Is the will of the Most High. Like it has been the plan of the Most High to place us and to make us this way as spiritual beings to be able to relate with the physical environment. So secondly, we have no control over the spiritual space once we depart from this physical space. Only the Most High, only Yah, does have control and supremacy in that space. But we have control over the physical space that we presently live in, and it has pleased the Most High to give us the willpower to be able to manage this physical space, even as spiritual beings. And lastly, it has pleased Yah to house us in a physical vessel, which is our physical bodies, so we as spirit beings can relate with the physical environment. So Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, at that time had this dream that troubled him. This dream kept troubling him, not just because of the dream he had, but also because he could not remember the dream he had. And he kept being troubled by the dream and not also remembering the dream that was troubling him, or not being able to remember the dream that troubled him. So he has the most powerful man on earth at that time, the king of Babylon, who had subdued the most part of the earth under him, especially the children of the Most High, the nation of the Most High. He relied, or he had the best, he is supposed to have the best hands around him, the best people. So it is recorded that he had astrologers, magicians, and sorcerers around him, and these were the best people in that in their various fields to give him wisdom and give him directives and even predict the future. So he had this dream that he could not remember, and that was troubling him. So he asked these best men around him to remind him of the dream. And they said to him that it would be impossible for anyone to tell a dream that someone had if they are not told or informed about the dream. Like, how do I know the dream you had? If you don't tell me about the dream. So they were like, we can't tell you this dream unless you tell us the dream. But he wanted them to tell. Nebuchadnezzar wanted these astrologers and magicians and sorcerers to remind him of the dream, but they couldn't do that. So that even made him more furious. So it happened that someone amongst the Babylonians remembered Daniel, who was a Hebrew Israelite, who was Yah's, Yah's, Yah's son, or Yah's servant. And not just Daniel. Daniel also had friends and cousins and other fellow Achaebolans or Israelites that were captured alongside him by the Babylonians, and they were used as slaves in Babylon. So at that time, Daniel was already in prison with the other children of Israel, and they were used to do hard labor in Babylon. So someone remembered Daniel and went to get Daniel. And when Daniel came, the king asked Daniel to remind him of this dream. And Daniel was able to remind the king the dream the king had. So he told the king the dream and also interpreted the dream to the king. Now, the point I'm making here is that Daniel and the other children of Israel were completely different people from these Babylonians. But Babylon has always relied on the resources of the people of the Most High to build their nation. So here again we see a good example of that, how the king of Babylon relied on a slave, Daniel, to rely on his wisdom to tell him a dream and also interpret the dream. So it's like the way forward for Babylon was only made possible by the help of the slaves. And yeah, so that's that's an important point to note there. All right. So the dream Nebuchadnezzar had, Daniel told the dream, and it was a dream. It was a great image of excellent brightness. And the head of that image was of gold, and the breast and arms of silver, the elli and thighs of brass or bronze, and the legs of iron, the feet of mixture of iron and clay. And then there was a stone cut without hands that struck the feet of the great image. So all this we can find in Daniel chapter 2 verse 31 to 34. So now all these things or items that the king saw in his dream, the king of Babylon saw in his dream, all these natural materials or resources, gold, silver, bronze, iron, clay, which were sought after by the oppressive nations of Babylon at that time. And they sought all these items from the suppressed nations. And talking about the nation of God's people or Yah's people, and the greater part of which is the region of Africa. And Babylon sought all these items to build their own nation. They sought all these items to build their own nation. So this is a key finding or fact that was extrapolated by United Nations statistics in 2019. It says that the lifestyles of people in the richest nations are heavily dependent on resources extracted from poorer countries. That's word for word. Based on per capita, developed countries depend on 9.8 metric tons of raw materials extracted from elsewhere in the world, that is, developing countries. So this is so straightforward. So the so-called developed nations have been built based on the resources of the so-called developing nations. So the developed nations have always depended on the developing nations to build their system. So without the developing nations, there will be no developed nations. And we saw that we can relate this to what happened in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. who used Daniel and the other Hebrew Israelites to build the kingdom of Babylon. And so this trend has been right from time, and it's not new. And today we see how the even Eurocentric system and the Western world have relied on the developing nations, especially Africa, where it has been said that Africa is actually the raw material of the earth, and they have depended on Africa to build their system, their Babylonian system. And so this just tells us that what is happening today is not new. It's been like that from time. Yeah, so this is something I got from United Nations stats, and is a fact. You can look this up on the internet. Now, I got this from a study carried out by Al Jazeera Media on Africa's natural resources, showing us that the natural resources which are used to manufacture mobile phones are mostly taken from Africa. So this tells us clearly that the mobile phone industry or companies of this world rely solely on the natural resources of Africa to build their businesses. So if there was no, if there's no Africa, there will be no electronic business. So this applies not just to mobile phones, to any other kind of electronics. You can think about computers, and household appliances and all of that. So they have to rely on Africa for aluminium, titanium, copper, satellite. I mean, talking about large scale dependence here. Africa hosts is the bed for for these raw materials, on a large scale. So whether you're producing batteries, whether you're doing circuit board or the mobile body or anything at all, you rely on these natural materials, which are mostly gotten from Africa: bauxite, tin, silica, potassium, and yeah, and everything. So this also is similar to what we saw in the time of King Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the ruler of Babylon, and even those that became kings of Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar and even before Nebuchadnezzar, how they have consistently relied on the resources, the natural resources and wisdom and human resources of Africa or Akable land to build their system. So in that same study by Al Jazeera Media, the mineral resources of different African countries were mapped. So you can see here that there is no one African country that a mineral cannot be found. So that tells you the huge dependence on this continent by the oppressor or so-called developed nations, the Babylonian nations of this time, and the entire world on Africa. So they depend hugely on Africa. And this again confirms that Babylon was completely a different nation from the people, the nation of God's people. And Babylon can be, the present day Babylon can be seen to be the Eurocentric system, the West, and all those who have positioned themselves as developed nations. And they are taking advantage of the land of the Most High and the people of the Most High, who are Africans by descent, depending on both the human and natural resources to build their own artificial kingdoms. So this tells us again, so we can see the map and how mineral resources are scattered across the promised land. This is a land that is filled with milk and honey. Yeah, we can say this is a land filled with milk and honey, very rich, the richest continent in the entire world. Yeah, so it's naturally a base for raw materials Yeah, and so this has been the trend right from time, and it has not changed even till date. How the Babylonian system is taking advantage of the people and resources of the promised land, or God's people. So this is the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. We see how the oppressive empires were built by these natural resources. From history and geography, Africa has been the hub of the resources that Babylon, Media-Persia, Greek Empire, Roman Empire, and the subsequent empires have used in developing their nations. So in 606 BC, the Babylonian Empire relied on the gold from Africa. Africa is popularly known as Africa today, but it used to be Akabuland. So they relied on this gold in 606 BC to enrich their nation. Not just the gold, also the people of the land where those raw materials came from, as we saw in Daniel and his fellow countrymen and women who were taken captives as slaves, and whose wisdom, knowledge, and natural skills were tapped into and usurped by the kings of Babylon to remain in control. So in the Media-Persia era of dominance, they relied mostly on the silver, and they left out gold in Babylon, and also enslaved the people from Africa as well. And we also see that in the Greek era of dominance, they relied mostly on bronze, and they left out silver and gold from the preceding fallen empires. Then in the Roman era of dominance, they depended mostly on iron to build weapons and structures alongside the bronze, silver, gold of preceding fallen empires, and the enslaved people to build their countries. So the end time empires are an industrial nations. They are an industrial setting. They have used iron and clay to build rails, structures, weapons, and so on. The mixture of iron and clay represents many big and small nations coming together to form a League of Nations that are not actually united in true sense. So we have United Nations, G7, OECD, BRICS, NATO, and so on and so forth. So they do so to continue to suppress and share the resources of the oppressed nations or the promised land and her people. Talking about Africa here. So Daniel was interpreting the king's dream, and Daniel said in verse 38 of Daniel 2, "You are the head of gold," referring to the king of Babylon. "After you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. So as the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united anymore than iron mixes with clay. So Daniel's interpretation of this dream is what we have seen right from that time even till now, how various empires have come to overthrow preceding empires, and have not only overthrown preceding empires, taking advantage of their business model or dominance model, and mix it with their own innovative model to continue with the same purpose of suppressing and oppressing Yah's people, and taking advantage of the resources of the promised land, talking about Africa here. So today, as Daniel interpreted in verse 42, that there is a mixture now of different nations all competing to be superpowers and to show their relevance and dominance, and all of this, as the effect of it is on Africa and the people of Africa, who are God's people, and the land, which is God's land as well. So they all have one purpose, which is to oppress and to steal and to destroy. So that's the mixture. So they pretend like they are one. United Nations pretend they are one, but they are not. BRICS pretend they are one. They are not. G7, G20, they all pretend. NATO all pretending that they are one, but they are not. But they are just out there to share the resources of the promised land and the people. So Daniel continued in verse 44. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. So, in the same end time, these oppressed people, or the people of African descent, or the land of Africa, a nation where we realize who they are, and that is what is going on now. The people of the Lord their eyes are beginning to open. The Spirit of the Most High is being poured upon His people, and the eyes of Yah's people are beginning to open, and they are beginning to realize who they are, their story. They are beginning to reclaim their story. They are beginning to showcase their culture again, to retrace their steps back to who they originally are as Yah's people, and their self-worth as well. And they are deciding to come from afar, from different places of the earth where they have been oppressed and scattered, and they are gathering themselves to unite with the rest of their people in the land of Africa, to take back what has been stolen from them all this time. So it's as the saying goes, you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. So these are key points to note. Different empires, but the same purpose. So we've seen the reign of different empires, but the same purpose, right from the time of Babylon even till now. The present-day empires are United States and the so-called other developed nations, including Russia, China, and the rest of them, all with a single purpose. So nothing has changed much. What has been still is. The enslaved or oppressed people are always dependent upon by these oppressors. So the stone which the builder has rejected, is eventually becoming the chief cornerstone, and the kingdom will come by the stones. So no empire ultimately proved better than the previous one. They all have the same purpose, and they're all in a quest for ultimate power and control. They may present promises to the people of Yah to make them look better, whether enticing them by immigration or the so-called greener pastures, better life. But it is the same purpose of oppressing and usurping the suppressed people and their land. So the strategy of usurping the people and their resources employed by these ancient empires is pretty much the same strategy used by the present-day empires or oppressor nations, the West and others over Africa. So immigration is the new slave ship that is used to move the oppressed people from their land to work as slaves in the developed nations. The instability promoted in these oppressed nations is aimed at keeping them poor and to always seek greener pastures in the so-called developed nations. So the stone which was cut out of the mountain and crushed the empire of iron and clay represent the kingdom of Yah and his people, who have experienced oppression for the longest time and who will begin to arise, who are beginning to arise in unity to the realization of their worth and history, and are starting to take back what they own from their oppressors. The stone which the oppressors devalued and suppressed will be the stone to eventually be relied on by the world. It has always been, though. So the world will depend on these resources and people of the oppressed nations, depending on Africa and her people, and will eventually respect their opinions and presence that were once ignored and despised. until they fully take control of their own land, culture, and spirituality. So this will form a huge part of how the kingdom of Yah will come. These are the references used in this presentation. Hallelujah.